I'm going to talk about bilingualism and ASD. And what I decided to do for this presentation was to do a sort of overlook of the literature on this issue. We have started working on this at Tours, although currently we don't have many detailed results that are ready for presentation. We applied for a grant recently on the topic, but I thought it might be an interesting domain of research to introduce to you, a domain of research which is relatively new, as Theo mentioned. So the title of the talk is Growing Up with Two Languages, Particularly Challenging for Autistic Children. And I will start with the answer to this question, or attempt of an answer, by saying that many studies say no, that in fact children with autism can grow up quite nicely, I should say, in a bilingual setting, that it's not going to create any additional difficulties. And yet, to this day, many families are often advised against using more than one language with a child. And that should be for fear that using two languages might be confusing for the child, harm his or her language development. We have stories of families stopping using the home language with a child who has ASD, but keeping using the home language with the siblings, and only using, say, English, or let's say the majority language with a child with ASD, thus creating some feelings of rejection or isolation, so with serious consequences. And so the idea here is, for this presentation, to look at the research on the impact of bilingualism on language development in ASD. Is it really true to say that growing up with two languages is particularly challenging for children with ASD? And so looking at this, I've decided to first give a brief introduction on ASD and bilingualism. I mean, bilingualism, it's going to be extremely brief, but ASD, I'll have a couple of slides on this. Look at the research questions that the literature has tried to answer to, and then I will focus on two, let's say, areas of research, looking at language evaluation. What was evaluated in research? How was it evaluated? And who was evaluated in this research on bilingual children with ASD? And then I looked at which bilingualism factors have been investigated and how they were investigated. Sorry, and then I will move on to a discussion and suggestions for further research. So ASD is a neurodevelopmental disorder with marked impairments in two domains, particularly social interaction in communication, and restricted and repetitive pattern of behaviors, interests, or activities with respect to language that may be translated into stereotyped speech, echolalia, the fact that children may use speech routines, etc. In terms of diagnosis, a clinician should specify if, along with ASD, the child has intellectual impairment or not, and whether the child has language impairment or not. And in fact, this creates a world of heterogeneity, which is humongous. The prevalence, according to the latest surveys in 2020, says that among 8-year-old children, 1 in 54 children is affected. And the current male to female ratio is 4:1. There's a lot of comorbidities that have been that are associated with ASD, and the one that I'm going to be particularly interested in here is intellectual disability, which affects about 30% of individuals with ASD. And here, when you read the literature, you see that the borderline, the distinction between children with intellectual disability or not sometimes fluctuates according to their scores on IQ tests, and that's why here I chose to add the borderline IQ threshold, which is sometimes incorporated in the normal range. So we agree that low IQ is below 70. Normal IQ between over 80, but the borderline IQ sometimes goes with low or normal IQ according to studies. When looking at language abilities in ASD, the first thing that we need to say is that there's been reports of language delay in many children, and here you have the results of a large study that was carried out in France in 2009, looking at around 160 children. And as you can see here, a large proportion of children have delayed first words and delayed first phrases compared to what we find in TD children. And in fact, concern for the well-being of the children on the part of the parents that drive them to consult a clinician or medical doctor is delayed language. We also find about 30% of children with ASD that have minimal language. So language does not, in fact, develop, let's say, at all in some cases. We know that with respect to language abilities, outside of the fact that language may be delayed, children with ASD may have different abilities with respect to different domains of language. With respect to pragmatics, for example, it is pretty clear that all children, have impaired pragmatic abilities. They may have inappropriate turn-taking in conversations, difficulties to adjust to the communicative setting, difficulties differentiating between old and new information, and understanding non-literal language. Of course, there are some degrees of severity in that, but pretty much everyone is affected. With respect to other areas of language, things are a little bit blurry. So you have a number of children that also have language impairment that goes beyond pragmatics. They may have particular impairments in phonology and morphosyntax. And we call these kids, they are labeled often ALI, autism with language impairment. Other children seem to have normal language abilities. They're often referred to as ALN, autism with normal language. And this drives people to make comparisons between, say, ALN children with typical development, ALE children with typical development, and also within the autism world, let's say ALI versus ALN comparisons. There also comparisons that are often made between ALI children and children with SLI, or in order to see whether the type of language impairment, especially having to do with structural language, is the same or not, whether the children with ALI have the same types of difficulties as children with DLD. DLD being a pathology that affects language is and of itself in the absence of other impairments. And so it is interesting to compare these two populations. And I'm saying all this because this will have some bearings naturally as to what will be said about bilingual children. Another thing to be said about language abilities in ASD, there's growing research about the crossing between language abilities and nonverbal cognition, leading to several profiles that to be found in children with ASD. And according to the International Classification of Diseases, the latest one, 2018, there are 4 diagnosis categories, in fact, that are identified. So children with autism and no language impairment, accompanied with a disorder of intellectual development. In green, no language impairment and no disorder of intellectual development, so normal intellectual development. And then in language impairment accompanied with disorder of intellectual development and language impairment with no disorder of intellectual development. And there's growing research showing evidence of the existence of these 4 profiles, including the one specifying a dissociation between language development and intellectual development, specifically children with no language impairment and with intellectual impaired intellectual development. And this is particularly interesting, showing that these 2 capacities may be, let's say, independent from each other. With respect to bilingual children, I'm not going to give an introduction. You've probably been following other presentations in this series, and if you're there, you are most particularly interested in bilingualism, I take it. Here, I'm only going to talk about some factors that have been identified as playing a role in bilingual language development: age of onset, length of exposure, quantity, quality of input, or input richness, the linguistic properties of the languages of the child, so linguistic typology. There are many others that of course have been investigated in the literature. And one of the reasons why we're interested in bilingual children with ASD is that if we take bilingualism and expand in global phenomenon, which is certainly the case in Europe, there is a number of autistic children growing up in bilingual settings as well. And so what to do with these children, what kind of clinical care should we propose to them? How do we address the issue of the languages that should be spoken to the children by the family? We need to understand how language development takes place in these children. Here I give you a sense of the prevalence of bilingual and multilingual children that that consult or that receive speech and language therapy. It does not address specifically the issue of ASD. The children could be seeing SLTs for different reasons. But I would like to point out the large percentage of children coming from bilingual and multilingual settings receiving SLTs, and that includes children with ASD as well. And so there's a real need to address the issue of how to address children with SLI, children with ASD in a bilingual environment. And the issue of language impairment in bilingual children has recently been the topic of really large projects and recent ones. The one that Theo mentioned a few moments ago, cost action on language impairment in multilingual society. There's also the cost action IS 1406 that followed the previous one. It was not particularly dedicated to language impairment in bilingual children, but the issue of language impairment in bilingual children was addressed. And these actions led to many, many different projects in collaboration with the people that participated. And really, there's been a boom in investigating language impairment in bilingual children in recent years. Here I did I show you a recent search that I did on PubMed, just to look at the number of papers on bilingualism, ASD, language. And you can see first that there's almost nothing before, let's say, 2010. It's very few papers, but the attention has grown since then. Still not not that many papers, but you can see that that it's increasing. And for this presentation, I'm going to focus on 20 papers. Let's say that I'm going to review how research was done in these papers here. So the research questions that are mostly addressed in these papers are the following. It's kind of an overarching and sub-questions being raised. The first one being, is language development in bilingual children with ASD different from that found in typical bilingual children, or from that found in other children with other developmental pathologies? And a sub-question for this is learning two languages an aggravating or boosting factor in children with ASD? And we'll try to see whether the literature manages to answer them. So the objective is to see whether existing research provides satisfactory answers to these research questions, what properties of the existing literature prevent us from answering these research questions with satisfaction, and what are some priorities for future research investigating language development in bilingual children with ASD. So let's first address the issue of language evaluation in the literature. And the review I'm going to do is a review that I conducted with my colleague, Laurie Thaler in Tours. And it's part of a paper that we are writing for a lab on the issue of language development in bilingual children with ASD. So I wanted to mention that before we start. So As far as language evaluation is concerned, I'm going to talk about what language domains have been investigated, how they were assessed, and who were the children that were investigated. And as far as bilingualism factors, I'm going to talk about the type of comparative groups that were used, the age of onset, and language exposure. With respect to language domains, in fact, out of my 20 papers, there are actually quite a lot looking at the lexicon and looking at or deriving data from parental reports or questionnaires. Very little, in fact, has been done on structural language. For example, there's been only one paper on phonology. And when we talk about, let's say, the different measures that were used, you can see that many measures come from indirect evaluation, so parent reports or questionnaires, so things like the Vineland, CCC2, ADI-R, and also the CDI. Some studies focus on global measures of language. And in fact, what I would like to argue is that in many cases, in fact, the data that you get is quite imprecise. For the lexicon, we have the usual measures that we are used to, the PPVT, the Mullins. ELOL is a Lebanese standardized test. And then you have the some of the tasks that were developed during the cost action on bilingual language impairment. I'm going to give you an example of parental questionnaire to address the issue of the type of data that you can come across in the literature on bilingual children with ASD. So in many studies, you have scores of receptive language and expressive language, or receptive communication and expressive communication that are reported. And these may put together questions about, for receptive communication, whether the child understands facial expressions, a certain number of words, whether the child manages to identify objects or respond to questions or follow instructions. And for expressive communication or language, questions about the syllable speech sounds that he makes, what he is able or she is able to name in terms of actions or objects, whether the child manages to use phrases with a noun or verb, etc. And all this is put together into a global score for receptive communication or expressive communication. Usually it's the parents answering. And so it's the scores that you get may be both outside of the fact that they're indirect, so you don't actually collect the data based on an experiment. They also can be quite imprecise. There are a number of standardized tasks that can be used, that have been used, in research with children with ASD, and in general, not only with bilingual children with ASD, but many of these standardized tasks that address the issue of language development require the integration of many skills, such as inference, and auditory information, pragmatic skills, And this can be quite problematic for this population. Here I give you an example of the task of formulated sentences from the KELF. The KELF is widely used in research on English-speaking children with ASD and also with other impairments. And according to the manual, okay, this is what the child needs to do, formulating a sentence based on a visual stimulus using a particular word. And this is what the manual says. These abilities, so the abilities that that the task targets, should reflect the capacity to integrate semantic, syntactic, and pragmatic rules, as well as constraints while using working memory. So you see that there are many skills here that are targeted, and couple this with the fact that you have a visual stimulus, which is quite heavy, a lot of details here, and for children with ASD, that might be an occasion to get lost. And indeed, when you look at how such tasks can be used in children with ASD, you see that, in fact, not that many children are able to complete such tasks, especially when you compare that to tasks targeting vocabulary, such as the PPVT. And here I give you the result of a study back in 2001, showing you that among all the tasks that were administered to the kids with ASD, half of them, or actually less than half of them, managed to complete the KELF battery. Now, of course, this could mean that the children didn't have any the language skills that are necessary to complete them, but it could also be due to something else, the inability to just do the task. On a side note, in the literature on ASD, very few times do you see these types of percentages, the percentage of children that managed to pass the tasks that were part of the experimental protocol. Here I'm going to suggest that tools that may be, let's say, more appropriate for kids with ASD include repetition tasks to target structural language in particular. These are tasks that were developed during the cost action on language impairment in bilingual children that Phil mentioned before, non-word repetition targeting phonology, and sentence repetition targeting morphosyntax. And these are tasks that are not based on visual stimulus, asking the child to integrate visual and audio stimuli. They are really easy to understand. There is little practice in terms of being part of a conversation, or asking the child to take the role of someone. They're linguistically motivated, and they manipulate areas of language, syllable structure, and morphosyntax that are known to be complicated to deal with by children with language impairment. So they are pretty interesting tasks to use with children with ASD, and in fact, when we use them, including with children with actual deficiency, we found in two that the vast majority of the children could manage to complete them. So it's pretty interesting. When we look, and I'll come back to that, that's why, I mean, I spend time on this because I'm going to talk about them later on with respect to bilingualism. So moving on to issues having to do with methodology, again, in these studies on bilingual children with ASD, we find that a lot of them have few participants, and that's a problem, especially taking into account the fact that, you know, interacting the world of bilingualism and ASD creates a huge amount of heterogeneity. And also the age range of the children vary a lot. What about the kind of children that were investigated? Well, we find that the majority of studies are investigating children with high functioning autism, so children with normal IQ. There are very few studies that have looked at children from the entire spectrum. Some of them do, but there are very few participants that are involved. And what about children with language impairment? So bilingual children with ASD and language impairment. You can find them, they're present in some studies, but they are largely incorporated in group results. And there are studies that really focus on them. I'm going to talk about them in a few seconds. But generally, yes, they're mentioned, but they're not, we don't know so much about their performance. Here, I'm going to incorporate everything I've said so far to show you the result of a study we conducted in 2020 with our ex-PhD student Silvia Silaresi, where we had 68 participants, 54 monolinguals and 14 bilinguals, age 6 to 12. And what we did here was we put all the kids together and we did a cluster analysis. So we didn't put the kids into groups. We let the machine tell us how the results clustered together. And we used different types of measures, a measure of morphosyntax, sentence repetition, as I just mentioned, and also measures of non-verbal reasoning, such as block design, matrix reasoning from the WISC, and Raven's matrices. And we're interested in the interaction between language skills and non-verbal skills. And we got 5 clusters from our analysis, and 3 of them corresponded to let's say, above cutoff performance on morphosyntax, and so LN, and 2 of them corresponding to impaired language, so low performance and morphosyntax. And by the way, we did the same with phonology, so non-word repetition, and we got the same similar results. And we also saw that some of these clusters were associated with low nonverbal IQ, and others with average or high nonverbal IQ. And so at the end, we got an interesting combination of different profiles, putting together language impairments and low IQ, language normal and low nonverbal IQ, et cetera, which more or less corresponded to what you can find in the ICD, the International Classification of Disease. And with respect to the bilingual kids, we found the kids, the bilingual ones, in each of the clusters that were obtained. And that was very interesting. We didn't observe anything with respect to the kids with bilingualism, ASD, bilingual kids with autism, forming one profile or being completely distinguished with from the monolinguals. Instead, they were nicely divided into the different profiles. Another study, very recent study done in Israel, also on sentence repetition in Hebrew and Russian, found really interesting results with respect to the issue of the influence, potential influence of bilingualism over kids with ASD. This is a study that was restricted to high-functioning autism. And you can see here the results from monolinguals, bilinguals, so with high-functioning autism, and kids with typical development, monolingual and bilingual. And you can see that there was not that much difference between the monolinguals and the bilinguals with autism. It's not the case that the bilinguals performed much worse or much better from that matter. And in fact, similar tendencies were observed here. So between the MoTDs and the BioTDs, the difference was not that great. There was an effect of diagnosis. So the kids with ASD tended to perform lower. But very interestingly, there was no significant interaction between clinical status and language status, suggesting that bilingualism with respect to kids with autism did not affect their performance significantly. Here I give you some individual results. I find this study interesting because it's one of the few studies also that tests both languages of the bilingual kids. And what it shows here you have the monolinguals with a cutoff for repetition for Hebrew. Here the bilinguals also with a cutoff for Hebrew, and here the cutoff for Russian. And you can see that these kids here, the monolinguals, you have a number of kids that have low performance, the kids with autism, high functioning autism. And you also have kids here that have low performance in the bilingual kids, that are performances that are low both in Russian and Hebrew. And in both cases, this corresponds to kids with autism. And so in both cases, monolingual and bilingual, you have performances that are low, that may be indicative of language impairment. And the authors also looked at the types of errors that the bilingual kids and the monolingual kids with autism did. And in fact, they were quite similar. And they resemble also errors done by children with DLD. Very often, if we move to another type of let's say, observations on what people have done in previous research, it's interesting to look at the comparative groups that they used. And in many cases, the comparative group is more ASD, so monolinguals with ASD. And the idea here is to see whether the bilingual kids with ASD perform worse or better than monolinguals with ASD, with the idea behind to see whether bilingualism has a particular effect on performance. And the results seem to suggest that, in fact, the monolinguals and the bilinguals with ASD perform quite the same. But I have to say that most of these studies have looked at indirect measures of language. They have looked at vocabulary. It would be interesting to do more stuff maybe with structural language. A very interesting result here having to do with language developmental milestones, ages of first word and first sentences. It seems to be the case that language is as delayed in bilingual kids with ASD as it is with monolingual kids with ASD. And this applies both to first words and first sentences. So it's not the case that bilingual kids have an even more delayed language development. So this is a rather busy slides. I just wanted to give you some results when we start comparing bilingual kids with ASD and TD children with respect to vocabulary, morphology, and morphosyntax. Basically, what we find is bi-TD kids have perform better than bilingual kids with ASD as a group result. In some cases, you find no significant interaction between clinical status and language status. As I said, in some cases as well, you have performance which is equal in bi-TDs and by ASD. For example, pronoun omission and in Hebrew. But by and large, bi-TD kids perform better than kids with ASD. There've been also some studies looking at children with developmental disorders. They're called developmental disorders, but in fact they are global delayed more than anything when you look at the detail, and it's I mean it's quite the number of studies looking at that are quite reduced, and they're mainly focused on global measures and vocabulary, such as the Mullen scales. They seem to be in young children, no effective language group and language group and diagnosis. But I'm not going to dwell too much on that. There are very few studies. Moving to bilingualism factors. In fact, what I spend a lot of time on group results because bilingual effect of factors of bilingualism have not really been taken into account. When we look, for example, at age of onset, we have two types of bilingual kids that have been looked at: kids with simultaneous bilingualism and sequential bilingualism. Most of the studies are done on simultaneous bilingualism, and when you look at the definition of how simultaneous bilingualism was instrumented, you find quite different results. So for some authors, it means exposure to both languages from birth. Others, age of onset is lower than 36 months, and you need to have exposure to and use of both languages on a daily basis at testing time. You have another definition saying that exposure to another language should be over 20% of the time to be considered simultaneous bilingual. And you have to otherwise have ongoing exposure to 2 or more languages at home between 0 and 24 months, and at least 20% exposure to each of the 2 languages between 24 months and language assessment. So it's pretty varied. For age of onset, the studies that have looked at that sometimes don't specify exactly the range of age of onset. Sometimes the distinction is done between simultaneous and sequential with a threshold of 12 months, which is very low. Yes, again, very different ways of implementing the different types of bilingualism. Looking at specifically the way age of onset has been integrated into performance. The study by Hamley and Fombon, 2012, reported that there was no difference between simultaneous bilinguals and sequential bilinguals. But the cutoff age was really low, as I said before, 12 months. And all these, actually, these studies were done based on indirect measures of language. And we have here another study where no significant age of onset was found. It seems that age of onset doesn't play a role, but really, it's quite preliminary in terms of results. Language exposure, in terms of richness of exposure, length of exposure, has been looked at, but really to a little extent. And in some cases, the language measure is indirect. One doesn't find any significant correlation in these studies. Another one using vocabulary showed that there might be some kind of a correlation, but really, and it's quite interesting actually. Many studies use parental questionnaire to document language exposure, language use, etc., to define the groups, but then they don't use the information in the results or try to find correlations or perform a regression analysis. In some studies, richness of exposure, length of exposure is indirectly taken into account when they test the language deemed to be dominant. And dominance is very much defined in those studies in terms of exposure and proficiency. I'm going to show you here the results of a study that does take into account language exposure. A very recent study looking at vocabulary in reception, PPVT, and morphology from the KELF. And you have two bilingual groups. In blue, you have the BiTD, and in green, the dotted line, the ASD kids, bilingual kids. Some kids actually were identified as having language impairment, and you have this ASD kids with language impairment, and you have this in the dotted line in yellow. And you see that in both cases, for the BiTD kids and the bi-ASD kids, exposure to French, these were tests carried out on French, was the strongest predictor. Not necessarily for the kids with language impairment, and anyway there were only 8 of them, so that's really not much. But this correlation with exposure is interesting, meaning that with time, kids with ASD growing up in a bilingual setting can improve on their proficiency. And by the way, the kids with language impairment in this study were identified on their performance on another subtest of the KELF, recalling sentences. But for that, monolingual norms were used, and this may be problematic when you deal with kids with bilingual upbringing to use norms that have been put forward on a monolingual situation. This is part of the problem of identifying language impairment in bilingual kids. So I don't know how much time I have. I need another 5 minutes. I hope this is okay. So if I put all this together, yes, the research seems to say no to the question, is learning two languages challenging for children with ASD, or let's say particularly challenging? Okay, it says no, but there are in fact very few studies. There are many methodological issues or concerns that can be raised in terms of number of participants. The fact that few studies have looked at children with ASD from the whole spectrum. The nature of the tools that were used to collect the data, often indirect measures, the issue of whether the tools are appropriate for the kids with ASD, use of monolingual norms to identify impairment, relatively little research on structural language. And in fact, what I'm saying here about bilingual children with ASD is also something that you could say on let's say, research on monolinguals with ASD. I mean, there are many more studies, but these are questions that are in fact general about research on ASD, language development in ASD. All this makes the comparisons across studies a little bit complicated. There's a large variation in terms of definition of bilingualism, the age of the participants, and of course the tools that we used. There's also little investigation of bilingualism factors. So as I said, the information gathered through parental questionnaires is not systematically exploited. There's some bilingualism factors that are under research, so the effect of SES, for example, typological distance. You always find more or less the same languages involved: French, English, Spanish. Sometimes you have a couple of studies on Greek, on Hebrew, Russian, Chinese, but really not enough to address the issue of typological distance. And then the issue of language status in the society, whether the home language is valued or not in society, and other factors that we can think of. The issue of group comparisons. I mention this because it's important to know what we mean to do when we compare the groups that we compare. So bilingual kids with ASD and monolingual kids with ASD, here obviously you focus on ASD and you try to see whether bilinguals can at least perform like monolinguals, whether they can reach the performance of monolinguals, and to address the issue of whether bilingualism is an aggravating factor. But we have to be very careful here because should bilingual kids with ASD perform lower than monolingual kids, that could be due to very different factors having to do particularly with bilingualism. Exposure comes to mind, obviously, but there might be others. It's, to me, very interesting to in fact focus on the comparison within bilingualism, ASD versus TD, and really look at how bilingual language development occurs in kids with ASD. In a way, it resembles what you find in research on bilingualism or L2 acquisition. For the longest time, L2 acquisition was compared to L1 acquisition. So you would always have L2 kids compared to monolinguals and see whether the performance of the L2 kids could reach the performance of the monolinguals. And okay, this is one type of study, but it has its limits. It's also completely normal to want to look at how L2 kids or bilingual kids develop without looking at what monolinguals do. And this is what the second type of comparison achieves. So there are still interesting results that we should capitalize on, I think. The fact that the language development milestones seem to be comparable in monolinguals with ASD and bilinguals with ASD. We've seen that in some cases you can have impact of language exposure when you really factor it in your results. We found some similarities between bilinguals with ASD and monolinguals with ASD in terms of language profiles and also in terms of the kinds of errors that they produce. And I think these are the types of studies that could be pursued. I have, I think, 3 more slides to go. I haven't talked about this before, but with respect to the issue of how kids with ASD manage to learn a second language, we find cases where the bilingual kid with ASD will choose, so to speak, to use the language least understood or spoken by their caregivers or their community in order to avoid social interaction. We've seen this in Tours, for example, at our autism center, where a bilingual kid, clearly seeing that everyone speaks French, starts speaking English, his home language, his or her home language, knowing perfectly well that no one will understand him or her. So it's the choosing a language in order to avoid social interaction, and you see this also with the use of standard Arabic in countries like Tunisia or Lebanon, instead of the sort of the language that everyone uses, Tunisian Arabic, Lebanese Arabic. And there have been some cases of children that seem to develop skills in the L2 via passive exposure, so watching television, for example. So without going through this sort of social input that is argued to be necessary for language development. And the last thing I wanted to talk about or address was the issue of executive function skills in bilingual kids with ASD and the potential relationship with language development. In some studies, but very few studies, the issue is addressed as to whether EF skills are boosted in kids, bilingual kids, compared to monolinguals. If so, for which executive function? And the issue of whether EF skills could be a protective factor for language learning in kids with ASD. Now, in bilinguals with TD, there have been numerous research showing that bilinguals have superior performance compared to monolinguals on several EF tasks. But I should also point out, and I think you had there was a presentation during the series on EF and bilingualism. This cognitive advantage of bilinguals have been actually challenged in other studies. I mean, I'm going to be agnostic with respect to that, but let's say if there is indeed an advantage for bilinguals for EF skills, does it also show in bilingual kids with ASD, and does it translate in advantages for language learning? Here, I have 3 studies that to me are interesting to look at. the results are mixed. Some studies find advantages for kids with ASD. So the study by Peristeri and colleagues, 2020, systematically, the bilingual kids with ASD perform better than the monolingual kids with ASD on visual attention, global local task, and also on working memory. But this was not the case in other studies. So, for example, in a study by Mayer Novodosky, also with inhibition and selective attention and working memory, no particular advantage for bilingual kids with high functioning autism. And the last one, recently by González Barrero and Nadig, advantages in some results for the bilingual kids, but not in others. So it's difficult to tell. Notice also that the tasks are different. So and yeah, to be continued. The authors of the first study showing a bilingual advantage found some interesting, significant correlations with language measures, and wonder whether bilingualism could compensate processing weaknesses in ASD. They remain agnostic to the answer, but definitely something that is worth pursuing. Should we tell the kids and the families to abandon the home language at the end? And the answer is probably no. There's no compelling arguments for this. There is a very recent study published on about quality of life, especially quality of social life, and the number of languages spoken by individuals with ASD, suggesting that the more languages they know, the better their social life is. So yeah, let's keep all the languages in. Thank you.